If you're soldering something like a ring join, normally both sides of the join are the same thickness, same size, so therefore to get them the same temperature, you heat them the same amount, so it's a fairly easy join to do. When you are heating a small thing to a bigger thing, it gets a bit trickier, and this is where people sort of panic, or the soldering starts going horribly wrong. So for example, if I've got a bigger base piece and a little bit of wire, as if I was making a little stud, this base piece is going to require a lot more heat to get up to temperature compared to this bit of wire. So what tends to happen is if you heat them the same amount, the little bit of wire will melt long before that base piece is anywhere near hot enough for the solder to run. So what tends to happen is the soldering doesn't work, and it's either because you melt your wire or because you panic because you know you're about to melt your wire, so therefore the base piece isn't hot enough for the soldering to work and people stop before it's too hot. So what you've got to remember is it's not about heating the bits you're joining together the same amount, it's about heating them to the same temperature. But if you're heating up something small and skinny, it's going to get hotter quicker than something big that's sitting lower down. So therefore, like I say, you need to heat them to the same temperature for the soldering to work. And we're going to judge that by the colour. So I'm going to set this up, but then I'm going to go and turn the lights off because you should be able to see the colour a bit better that way. So the first thing I need to do is take my flux, paint it where I want my pieces to join. Oh, I can pick it up. So I'm painting the end of my wire that's going to be in contact with it and the base of the sheet metal, and then I need to hold it in position. So that piece of wire is now pinned quite tightly against that base piece. As you can see, I've just used my cross-action tweezers and laid them on the brick, which is fine to do if you don't have a pair of third arm tweezers. So the third arm base would make it easier to hold on to, but just in case you haven't got one of these, I'm going to do it straight on the brick. The other thing I could do is hold the pin in place with the tweezers in my hand, if you've got a steady hand, while soldering. The next thing I need to do is cut a tiny bit of solder, and then because the solder likes to run towards the heat, I need to put it on the opposite side of the bit of wire to where I'm going to be heating from. If I can pick it up, always easier said than done. So I'm going to put it behind. Right, I'm going to be heating from this angle. So the little bit of solder is directly behind the bit of wire, opposite me, because the solder is going to want to run towards the heat and I want it to run under that little pin. If I'd put it in front of the pin, the solder might just run towards me and then not join the two segments together. The other important thing is that that little bit of solder needs to be sat flat on the base of the silver, but also butted up against the side of the pin. It needs to be touching both elements that you want to solder together. So now that that's ready, I'm going to turn on the blowtorch in a second and I'm going to heat it. If you remember from last time, the first thing that may happen is the flux may bubble when the water that's mixed in with it evaporates. Because of that, I'm going to gently heat next to it so that that water can evaporate slowly and not knock my solder out of position. Blowtorch is on. I'm just heating the air close to my piece so that the water can evaporate from that flux gently. And then in a minute what I'm going to do is I'm going to start heating my piece. But I'm going to be focusing all the heat on the base piece because if you remember that's bigger and it's going to need more heat to get up to temperature compared to the wire. I'm aiming for both bits, the wire and the base piece, to end up a dark cherry red. But to get there I'm going to be focusing all my heat on my base piece, trying to avoid the wire as much as possible. When the flux has gone clear and glassy instead of white and crusty, that's it telling me it's going to be hot enough for the solder to run in a second. So now I'm going to do a little wiggle up and down the wire and that's it run. So I knew it ran because I saw that little capillary action meniscusy layer creeping up the wire and it got a good red temperature. The other thing that I need to take into consideration when I'm trying to get separate elements up to the same temperature is if you're gripping onto something. So for example, in this case, I'm holding onto the wire with some steel tweezers. These tweezers are acting as what's called a heat sink. So what that means is these tweezers are zapping and pulling the heat away from the wire, which sometimes works, in your advantage, because if that's a skinny thing and you're trying to keep it a bit cooler, it's sometimes good. But equally, that's also why I'm holding the wire quite high up rather than using the tweezers and holding the wire further down, because then it really would be trying to zap the heat away from the area that I'm trying to solder. So it's all about heat balance. And if you saw that time, I was focusing all the heat on the base piece. As soon as that base piece went red, then I started doing a little wiggle to also incorporate the wire and get that up to temperature, because I knew that that little bit of wire would get very hot very quickly, so I didn't need to focus on it till right at the very end. There you go, nice neat solder join. I haven't done any cleanup to this other than popping it in the pickle, but you can see there's the right amount of solder used, but equally it's 100% on there. It's not going to snap off. It's well joined because it was a nice tight join and both surfaces were nice and flat, so there was no gaps between the join. Used the right amount of solder so you didn't end up with excess solder everywhere, and heated them both to the same temperature so that the solder would run onto both pieces, but equally so that I didn't melt this before this was up to temperature. So both the same red colour, and to achieve that I had to focus all the heat on the base piece because that was bigger and chunkier than this little bit of wire. Here we have one of the little samples from Make It Month 2 when we were using the jeweller's saw and piercing out shapes, and I attached a little jump loop to it, but the little jump loop hadn't been soldered yet. So what I'm going to do now is just show you how you can solder slightly more fiddly things. So I'm going to take my flux. Again, I'm going to paint the join. And if I was to swap a load of solder on here, or I wasn't supporting it, when that solder runs, when it flows, it could flow all the way around and attach itself to this, and I'd end up with a big old rigid thing and solder all over this. I only want it to stay confined to that little gap in the top of the jump ring. So I'm holding it with the third hand tweezers. Because these are the heat sink, like we discussed before, I'm holding it away from the join, but also keeping the join as far away as possible from the piece, the main piece. So I've painted the join with flux. I'm going to give it a gentle heat until all that water evaporates and bubbles away. And then, with some tweezers, I'm going to pick up my solder. I'm going to place it on the join. And then I'm going to go back in with the blowtorch, and I'm heating both sides of that join evenly. So I'm just doing little wiggles. And then when the jump loop's red, I'm going to do a little wiggle up and down the join to encourage the solder to go where I want it to go. And that's it done. So righty-tighty to turn the torch off. Quench it in the cold water. And we're done. Again, I haven't cleaned this up yet, but got a very neat soldered jump loop, so this is now completely solid. It can't come apart, but even though I use silver solder on the copper, by the time I give that little file and sand, you won't be able to see where the join is. There you go. So little fiddly things. I'm going to show you other ways of supporting your work, other ways of adding solder. And further on in the project, we're going to be looking at creating your own stone settings. So that's a really good example of where you solder something that's very thin and easy to mount onto a much bigger piece. But I want to actually be talking to somebody else through how to do that, so I can really keep the camera in focus and get a lot closer so you can see what's going on a lot better. It's a bit tricky when I've got cameras on tripods and it's refusing to focus. But for now, that's the basics. So if you've got any soldering based questions, like say at the minute specifically around using sheet solder, so usually silver solder rather than evil silver paste. And ways of supporting your work, just shout out, let me know, and I'll try and cover them off in videos later in the month. But it would be good to hear from you, and like I say, try not to be daunted by it. All it comes down to is having a nice tight join, so no gaps, and making sure that both sides are the same temperature, so they both need to get to that same cherry red, not angry orange, because that's when it's about to melt the whole thing, but nice dark cherry red, both elements. So if something is bigger and chunkier, you're going to have to apply more heat to that element to get it up to temperature compared to something thin and skinny. But if you can heat them to the same temperature, it should work.